The second Middle Passage. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the process by which African American slaves are bought and sold on the interstate slave trade. So in 1810, this is what the slave population looks like. There are about 800,000 slaves in the Upper South, about 300,000 in the Lower South. And so Upper South means like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. Lower South is South Carolina, parts of Georgia, and Florida. The Deep South is places like Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee. And so you can see in 1810, there are barely any slaves in the Deep South. But the Deep South is where the Cotton Revolution occurs. And so in order to transport that population, about 1.5 million slaves will be located in the Deep South on the eve of the Civil War. So in total, 1 million African American slaves are bought and sold in the 19th century. And so I hope these lectures are making it clear that slavery only gets worse in the 19th century, that even though some people are able to eke out promises of freedom, whether it's in the North or parts of the South, for the most part, the cotton and sugar revolutions and the Second Middle Passage mark a destructive moment for Black slaves. And so things are getting worse, not better. So in the interstate slave trade, some wealthy planters had enough money that they could just move their plantations from, say, Virginia all the way to Mississippi. But most planters would just sell their slaves, relocate, set up camp, and then purchase a whole bunch of other slaves on the auction block. And during the 19th century, the threat of sale becomes the most potent mechanism of slave discipline. Slave owners learned that the slave trade was a profitable way to rid themselves of unruly slaves, and so they were quick to get rid of slaves who had a history of rebelliousness or criminality. And so one observer of the slave trade says, quote, "Slaves dread nothing more on earth than this. They regard the South with perfect horror, and to be sent there is considered as the worst punishment that could be inflicted upon them." And so sales to the interior shattered 20% of slave marriages and separated 1 to 3 children from their parents. And so this painting illustrates women who are about to go and a few men who are about to go on the auction block. And you can see that mothers are holding their children and they're just terrified that they're going to be separated from them. And so initially, slaves were basically transported by walking. They had to walk 15 to 20 miles a day. But as slave owners standardized their routes, eventually they transported slaves on flatboats, steamboats, and railroads. And so by 1860, a slave could command over $1,000. So slavery was an incredibly lucrative process because especially if you purchased a woman, she could potentially birth multiple slaves for future generations. So under these circumstances, enslaved women and men employed different strategies of survival as conditions deteriorated in the 19th century with the interstate slave trade and the cotton and sugar revolutions. First, slaves used marriage and family as resources to assert their humanity and find comfort in the midst of chaos. In order to marry, slaves had to ask the permission of their owner. Slaves found it easier to negotiate marriages with owners if both slaves belonged to the same person. And so when a minister told slaves that they were married, he said, "Till death or distance do you part." And that's because slaves knew that their marriage was not a guarantee and they could easily be separated for sale on the interstate slave trade. A second survival strategy is something called fictive kin. So when slave parents knew that they were about to be sold, they would find somebody on the plantation to be a surrogate parent. And this became known as a fictive kin network. And so a woman says, "My mother said to Jules, take care of my baby. If I never see her, raise her for God." And God leads us to a third survival strategy. So it's in the 19th century that a lot of slaves begin to convert to Christianity. And this is in part because slaves are more identifying a little bit more with African American rather than African culture. The second thing is that some plantation owners allow ministers to come into plantations. And finally, slaves see promise and solace in the Exodus narrative of the Bible. And pragmatically, if they convert to Christianity, that means that they don't have to work on Sundays. So it sort of becomes a win-win for everybody. And so in the letters that you will read, you will see that slaves express a strong faith in Christianity.